The neighborhood of Crestwood Pines was supposed to be a picture-perfect community. Rows of manicured lawns stretched out like green carpets, each house painted in soft, neutral tones that matched the HOA's approved color palette. Driveways gleamed with late-model sedans and polished SUVs, all kept spotless to maintain the image of suburban perfection. For years, the Homeowners Association had prided itself on controlling every detail of life inside the gates. And for years, the residents tolerated it, swallowing the endless rules and fines in exchange for the promise of order and property value protection. But for one man, that balance was about to shatter. Michael Harris was not like the other homeowners. A retired mechanic in his late 60s, he had spent most of his life under the hood of cars and trucks. When he bought his house in Crestwood Pines, it wasn't because he wanted to fit in with the carefully managed lifestyle of the HOA. It was because he wanted peace, quiet, and a small driveway where he could park the one thing he loved most, his classic 1972 Ford F-250 pickup. It wasn't shiny. The paint had faded to a dull blue. The chrome had long since lost its sparkle, and the engine roared louder than most cars on the street. But to Michael, it was a treasure, a piece of history, and a symbol of everything he'd worked for. The HOA board, however, saw it differently. One crisp autumn morning, Michael walked out to grab his newspaper and noticed a bright orange envelope stuck under his truck's windshield wiper. It was his first fine. The note explained in cold, bureaucratic language that his vehicle was unsightly and in violation of community standards. The HOA demanded that he remove the truck from the driveway immediately or face daily penalties. Michael chuckled. At first. He thought it had to be some mistake. The truck wasn't broken down, it wasn't abandoned, and it wasn't leaking oil or blocking anyone's view. It was simply old. To him, it had character. To the HOA, it was a blemish on their image. He crumpled the fine into his pocket, deciding to ignore it, believing reason would eventually prevail. But reason never came. Over the next week, 2 more fines appeared. Each one carried a sharper tone, threatening legal action if the truck remained in view. Michael realized this wasn't just a warning, it was a campaign. Someone on the HOA board, likely its president, had made it their personal mission to get rid of his truck. That president was Linda Carrington, a woman who had ruled the Crestwood Pines HOA with an iron fist for nearly a decade. She believed her community was a showcase of suburban excellence, and anything that didn't align with her vision had no place inside the gates. To Linda, Michael's old Ford was more than just a truck. It was a challenge to her authority, and she would not tolerate defiance. Michael, however, was not the kind of man to bow easily. He had worked with his hands his entire life, built cars from scrap, and raised 2 children on a mechanic's salary. He wasn't about to be intimidated by a stack of paper fines. He paid his dues to live in Crestwood Pines, just like everyone else, and he wasn't going to give up his truck because a few people thought it was ugly. The standoff had begun. Weeks turned into months, and the fines piled up. Each morning, Michael would step outside to find another envelope tucked under his wiper, and each time he tossed it aside with a shake of his head. Neighbors began to notice the growing tension. Some sympathized with him, quietly admiring his refusal to give in. Others whispered that he was bringing unnecessary trouble to the community. The HOA board, fueled by Linda's determination, escalated their efforts, raising the fines and threatening to take Michael to court. What they didn't realize was that, with each fine, each letter, and each warning, Michael was growing more stubborn. To him, this wasn't just about a truck anymore. It was about principle, about standing up to the bullying tactics of an HOA that thought it could control every detail of his life. And if they thought they could break him, they were about to be proven very wrong. Michael began to hatch a plan. He knew the HOA wanted the truck gone because it was old and unsightly. So he decided that if they hated his Ford, he would give them something to really hate. Something so outrageous, so undeniably over the top, that they would regret ever picking this fight. But before he could put his plan into motion, the HOA delivered its most aggressive threat yet. A formal letter arrived in his mailbox, stamped with official language and legal jargon, warning that if he didn't remove the truck within 30 days, they would begin foreclosure proceedings against his home. They were prepared to take everything from him over a vehicle. Michael read the letter slowly, then folded it neatly and placed it on his kitchen table. His mind was already racing. They thought they could scare him into submission, but they had just lit a fire inside him. If they wanted a battle, he was ready to fight back. Not with lawyers, not with endless arguments, but with a display so bold that the entire neighborhood, and maybe even the world, would take notice. The countdown had begun. 30 days to remove his truck or lose his home. 30 days to show the HOA exactly who they were dealing with. 30 days to turn their obsession with control into their greatest embarrassment. And Michael knew exactly how to do it. The plan was simple, yet outrageous. It would take every ounce of his determination and a little help from old friends. But if it worked, Crestwood Pines would never forget the name Michael Harris. As the sun set over the quiet streets of the neighborhood, Michael leaned against the hood of his old Ford, staring at it like an old ally. He wasn't going to let them win, not this time, and soon the HOA would learn just how big of a mistake they had made. The HOA thought their 30-day ultimatum would break Michael. They imagined he would finally admit defeat, tow away his beloved Ford, and fall back into the quiet compliance they demanded of every resident. But instead, Michael saw the deadline as his opportunity to strike back. If they wanted to turn his truck into a community scandal, he would give them a spectacle unlike anything they had ever seen. For several days after receiving the foreclosure notice, Michael kept a low profile. Neighbors assumed he was finally giving in, perhaps preparing to remove the truck and end the standoff. But behind closed doors, he was busy making calls, digging through contacts and pulling strings. Being a mechanic for over 40 years had given him connections most people couldn't dream of. He knew scrapyard owners, trucking companies, contractors, and even a few collectors who specialized in oversized industrial vehicles. If anyone could find something big enough to make a statement, it was Michael, and he found it. 2 weeks into the 30-day countdown, a flatbed rolled into a lot on the outskirts of town, carrying something that made Michael's eyes light up. It was massive, towering above the surrounding cars like a mechanical beast. A decommissioned military transport vehicle once used to haul equipment across deserts and battlefields. Its tires were taller than most people, its frame built to endure punishment no suburban street was ever meant to handle. The paint was faded, the edges rusted, but it was still functional. To the average person, it looked like a relic from a war zone. To Michael, it looked like revenge. The plan was simple. If the HOA hated his pickup because it looked old and ugly, then he would replace it with something so enormous and impossible to ignore that their obsession with appearances would collapse under its own weight. He would park the transport vehicle right in his driveway, front and center, for the entire neighborhood to see. And if they wanted it gone, they would have to do a lot more than send fines. Michael spent the next 2 weeks preparing. He paid a mechanic friend to get the beast running smoothly. He cleared out his driveway, reinforcing part of the concrete to handle the weight. He even trimmed his hedges to make sure there was enough room to back it in. Every detail mattered, because when the day came, there would be no room for error. Word began to spread in whispers. A few curious neighbors noticed the trucks and equipment arriving at Michael's house. Others spotted him coming home covered in grease, grinning like a man with a secret. The rumors grew. Some said he was building a garage big enough to hide his old Ford. Others speculated he was preparing to move out entirely. But no one knew the truth. Not even Linda Carrington, who continued to press the HOA board with letters and threats, certain she was on the verge of victory. Finally, the day arrived. With just 48 hours left before the HOA's deadline expired, Michael made his move. Early in the morning, before most of the neighborhood had woken up, he drove the decommissioned military transport onto Crestwood Pines' main street. The engine roared like thunder, echoing against the rows of tidy houses. Windows lit up, curtains pulled back, dogs barked, and children stared wide-eyed from their porches. And then, with slow, deliberate precision, Michael turned into his driveway and parked the enormous machine directly where his old Ford had sat. The reaction was instant. Neighbors poured into the street, some laughing, some gasping, some pulling out their phones to record the spectacle. The transport vehicle dwarfed everything around it. The nearby sedans and SUVs looked like toy cars in comparison. Its massive tires sat just inches from the HOA-approved flower beds, its shadow stretching across the pristine lawns next door. The truck wasn't just parked, it was looming, a monument to defiance. Within minutes, Linda herself appeared, marching down the Yay Street in a fury. Her voice could be heard from blocks away as she barked at Michael, pointing at the monstrous vehicle. But Michael didn't respond. He didn't need to. His actions spoke louder than any argument ever could. By that evening, videos of the transport had spread across social media. Titles like "Grandpa Outsmarts HOA with Giant Truck" and "HOA Gets What They Deserve" began circulating online. The neighborhood that once quietly obeyed the HOA's every command was suddenly laughing at its leader. The HOA scrambled to regain control. Emergency board meetings were called. Letters were drafted. Lawyers were consulted. But nothing they did could erase the image of that towering vehicle parked proudly in Michael's driveway. The more they fought, the more attention it drew. Local news reporters arrived the next morning, cameras rolling as they interviewed neighbors, who couldn't stop grinning at the absurdity of it all. Crestwood Pines, once a model of suburban conformity, had become the stage for a battle between one stubborn man and an overreaching HOA. And Michael wasn't finished yet, because for him, parking the transport vehicle wasn't just about making a point. It was about showing that the HOA couldn't bully him into submission. He had proven that their obsession with control had limits, and now he intended to push those limits even further. The HOA wanted to escalate, but Michael was ready. He had already started planning his next move, one that would leave the community buzzing for years to come. As night fell, the enormous silhouette of the transport vehicle stood against the streetlights like a guardian, a warning and a declaration, all at once. Crestwood Pines had changed forever, and the HOA had no idea just how far Michael was willing to go. The morning after Michael parked the massive transport vehicle in his driveway, Crestwood Pines was buzzing like never before. The neighborhood, usually quiet except for the hum of lawnmowers and the shuffle of joggers, had become a spectacle. Cars slowed as they passed, gawking at the towering machine. Neighbors gathered in small groups, pointing, laughing, and filming videos for social media. By noon, the HOA president, Linda Carrington, realized she was losing control of her community. To Linda, order was everything. She had built her reputation on creating a pristine, uniform environment where no blade of grass dared grow taller than another. The sight of Michael's military transport truck sitting defiantly in a driveway felt like a personal insult, an attack on her authority. She had spent years cultivating her image as the iron-willed leader of Crestwood Pines, and Now it was unraveling before her eyes. She called an emergency HOA board meeting that same afternoon. Around a long mahogany table in the clubhouse, the board members gathered, their faces pale with disbelief. Some were outraged, demanding immediate action. Others looked nervous, aware of how quickly the story was spreading beyond their neighborhood. The videos circulating online had already gathered thousands of views, and the comment sections were filled with people mocking the HOA for overreaching. Linda didn't care about the online chatter. What mattered to her was regaining control. She laid out her plan with ruthless precision. They would fine Michael daily, at the highest possible rate allowed by the bylaws. They would file legal motions to have the vehicle declared a hazard, citing safety concerns about its size and weight. And if he refused to comply, they would seek an injunction to have it forcibly removed. To Linda, this wasn't just about the truck. It was about sending a message to anyone else who might dare challenge her authority. But Michael had anticipated this. The very next morning, he was served with a stack of papers outlining thousands of dollars in new fines, along with a warning that the HOA intended to take him to court. He read the papers calmly, then walked outside and placed them neatly on the hood of the transport vehicle, where the whole neighborhood could see. He wanted everyone to know exactly what the HOA was trying to do. It wasn't just about enforcing rules. It was about crushing anyone who stood in their way. The tactic backfired spectacularly. Neighbors who had once stayed silent began to speak up. Some sympathized with Michael, tired of living under the HOA's suffocating grip. Others who had quietly endured their own unfair fines or petty warnings now saw him as a symbol of resistance. Small acts of rebellion began popping up across the community. A resident painted his mailbox a shade of blue that wasn't on the approved color list. Another let her hedges grow higher than regulation height. Someone even parked an old camper in their driveway overnight just to see if the HOA would notice. The board tried to crack down, but the more they pushed, the more pushback they received. And at the center of it all stood Michael, calm and unshaken, with his colossal transport truck casting a long shadow across the street. As the HOA's frustration grew, so did the attention from outside. News vans began showing up regularly, their cameras aimed squarely at Michael's house. Reporters interviewed residents, capturing their divided opinions. Some called him a troublemaker, while others hailed him as a hero standing up to tyranny. The story spread from local news stations to national outlets, each headline more sensational than the last. Man versus HOA. The truck that broke the neighborhood became a trending story. Linda was livid. What had begun as a simple attempt to remove an old pickup truck had spiraled into a public relations nightmare. The HOA's credibility was crumbling, and every move they made seemed to fuel the fire. In desperation, Linda called the police, hoping they would declare the transport truck a safety hazard and tow it away. But when officers arrived, they found no law being broken. The vehicle was legally registered, insured, and parked on Michael's private property. It wasn't blocking traffic, and while its size was unusual, it violated no specific city ordinances. The police shrugged, apologized, and left, leaving Linda fuming on the sidewalk. Michael, meanwhile, leaned against the massive tire of his truck, smiling quietly as the cameras rolled. The more the HOA fought, the more powerless they looked. Their bylaws, once feared, were now being questioned. Their threats, once effective, were now laughed at. And yet, Michael knew this battle wasn't over. The HOA was wounded, but Linda was not the type to give up easily. She would push harder, dig deeper, and use every tool at her disposal to try to crush him. What she didn't realize was that Michael was prepared for her every move. He had more surprises waiting, and each one would chip away at her authority until there was nothing left. For now, though, the neighborhood reveled in the chaos. Children played in the shadow of the massive vehicle. Teenagers posed for pictures beside it. Families brought visiting relatives just to show them the truck that had made their neighborhood famous. Crestwood Pines, once a sterile model of suburban conformity, had become a tourist attraction. And as night fell, Michael sat on his porch, sipping a glass of iced tea, watching as the headlights of passing cars slowed to catch a glimpse of the monster in his driveway. He knew the HOA would be back with another plan, another threat, another desperate attempt to claw back control. But he also knew he had already won something far greater than they could ever take away: freedom from their fear. The question now was simple. How far would Linda go to reclaim her power, and how far was Michael willing to push her before the entire HOA collapsed under its own weight? The battle lines were drawn, and the war for Crestwood Pines had only just begun. The HOA had reached a breaking point. Every strategy Linda deployed seemed to crumble the moment it touched Michael's driveway. The transport truck stood tall like a monument of defiance, and each failed attempt to remove it only amplified Michael's legend. By now, Crestwood Pines was no longer just a suburban neighborhood. It was a battleground between order and rebellion, and everyone in town knew it. Linda realized that fines and threats would no longer be enough. The police had refused to act, the city had shrugged its shoulders, and the residents were turning against her. But she had one more weapon in her arsenal: the legal system. If she couldn't shame Michael into compliance, she would drown him in lawsuits. Within a week, Michael received a thick packet of documents delivered by certified mail. The HOA had filed for a civil injunction, accusing him of creating a public nuisance and endangering community safety by parking the massive transport truck on his property. They argued that the vehicle was a hazard to children, a risk to property values, and a violation of the HOA's charter, even though none of their bylaws specifically addressed oversized vehicles of that nature. Most homeowners would have panicked. Most would have caved under the weight of mounting legal fees, terrified of losing their home in a courtroom battle. But Michael was not most homeowners. He had spent his life dealing with stubborn bosses, irate customers, and the daily grind of making a living with his hands. Compared to that, a stack of legal papers seemed like little more than an inconvenience. Michael called an old friend, a lawyer he had once helped during a tough time by fixing his car for free. That lawyer owed him a favor, and now it was time to collect. Together they began crafting a defense that was as unshakable as the concrete under Michael's driveway. Meanwhile, Linda pushed the HOA harder than ever. She organized inspections, sending city officials to Michael's home in search of code violations. They measured his hedges, checked his gutters, and scrutinized every corner of his property. But Michael had prepared for this too. His lawn was immaculate, his fence freshly painted, and his home spotless. The inspectors left empty-handed, muttering that the man had done nothing wrong. Frustration boiled over at the next HOA meeting. Linda slammed her hand on the table, furious that every attempt was backfiring. Board members exchanged uneasy glances. Some began questioning whether this war was worth the damage it was causing. They whispered about the backlash, the bad press, the neighbors who were now openly mocking them. But Linda refused to bend. She declared that if they didn't stop Michael, they risked losing control of the entire community. She wasn't entirely wrong. Across Crestwood Pines, residents emboldened. By Michael's defiance began testing the limits of HOA authority. A man parked his old fishing boat in his driveway. Another homeowner put up a bright pink flamingo display that violated the approved decor list. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt alive, buzzing with a sense of rebellion. Rules that had once been followed out of fear were now ignored out of principle, and the spotlight on Michael only grew brighter. Reporters returned almost daily, their cameras catching footage of children climbing the enormous tires of his transport truck, laughing and posing for pictures. Local businesses even started selling shirts with slogans like "Bigger than the HOA" and "Michael's truck, Linda's rules." What had started as a quiet dispute over an old Ford had turned into a cultural phenomenon, but the legal storm was still brewing. The day of the first hearing arrived, and the courtroom was packed. Neighbors filled the benches, reporters lined the walls, and the air buzzed with anticipation. Linda sat stiffly in the front row, flanked by lawyers in tailored suits, their briefcases stacked with documents. Michael, by contrast, walked in calmly with his old friend, wearing the same work boots and flannel shirt he always wore. The HOA's lawyers launched into their arguments, painting Michael as a reckless homeowner whose actions threatened the safety and harmony of Crestwood Pines. They spoke of property values plummeting, of children at risk, of a community being torn apart. Their presentation was polished, but their evidence was thin. Then it was Michael's turn. His lawyer stood and methodically dismantled the HOA's case. He pointed out that the transport vehicle was fully registered, legally parked, and caused no measurable harm. He argued that the HOA's attempt to stretch its bylaws beyond their written limits was an abuse of power, and when he presented evidence of the HOA's escalating fines and threats, the courtroom murmured in disapproval. By the time the judge spoke, the outcome was clear. The injunction was denied. The HOA had failed to prove their case, and Michael was free to keep his transport truck right where it was. Linda's face turned pale. For the first time in her reign as HOA president, her authority had been publicly challenged and defeated. Worse yet, the loss was now a matter of public record, a humiliation broadcast to every homeowner and amplified by the news outlets covering the trial. Michael walked out of the courthouse with his head held high, greeted by cheers from his neighbors. Cameras flashed as he climbed into his truck and drove home, the engine's roar echoing like a victory march. But Linda was not finished. As she sat alone in her car outside the courthouse, clutching the rejected injunction papers, her anger hardened into resolve. If the courts wouldn't stop Michael, she would find another way. The HOA still had resources, still had influence, and still had the ability to make his life miserable. She swore to herself that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Michael, however, sensed that the war was far from finished. And as he parked his transport vehicle back in his driveway, he began planning for the next round of battles, because he knew Linda well enough to realize that she would stop at nothing to try to break him. The question was, how far would she go before everything came crashing down? The defeat in court was a devastating blow to Linda Carrington. For nearly a decade, she had ruled Crestwood Pines with strict precision, her word treated like law. But in one public hearing, Michael had shattered that image. The HOA had looked weak, their bylaws exposed as toothless, and their president humiliated. For the first time, whispers spread through the neighborhood that maybe, just maybe, the HOA didn't hold as much power as everyone believed. But Linda wasn't ready to let go. She told herself the fight wasn't about pride, it was about preserving the community. In truth, however, it was deeply personal. Michael had defied her in front of everyone, and she couldn't stomach the thought of losing to him. Each time she drove past his house and saw that towering transport truck, it felt like a slap in the face, a constant reminder of her failure. She grew obsessed. Board meetings stretched late into the night, dominated by her rants about Michael. She pressured the HOA's lawyers to find new angles, new loopholes, new ways to trap him. She hired private inspectors, hoping to catch him in some technical violation. She even reached out to county officials, demanding they intervene. But everywhere she turned, she was met with the same response. Michael was breaking no laws. Meanwhile, the neighborhood's attitude was shifting rapidly. Residents who had once feared the HOA's wrath now saw Michael as living proof that the rules could be challenged. Small rebellions turned into open defiance. Lawns became less manicured, decorations more colorful, and driveways filled with vehicles the HOA never would have allowed before. The community that had once prided itself on uniformity was now alive with individuality, and through it all, Michael remained calm. He tended to his home, waved to neighbors, and let the enormous transport truck stand as his silent protest. He didn't need to say a word. His actions had already done the talking. Each day that passed without the HOA removing the vehicle was another day of victory. Linda's frustration turned to desperation. She began drafting newsletters filled with warnings about the decline of the neighborhood, blaming Michael for everything from falling home values to increased traffic. But instead of rallying support, her words only fueled resentment. Homeowners mocked the letters, passing them around with laughter. Some even posted them online, where they quickly went viral as examples of HOA overreach. The more Linda tried to tighten her grip, the more it slipped away. Finally, in one last desperate attempt, Linda authorized an extreme measure. Late one night, under the cover of darkness, she arranged for a tow company to remove the transport vehicle. It was a reckless decision, one that ignored the legal protections already established in court. She convinced herself that once the truck was gone, Michael would be powerless to fight back. But things did not go as planned. When the tow truck arrived, its driver took one look at the massive vehicle and shook his head. It was far too heavy for his equipment. The transport truck was designed for military operations, not suburban driveways, and no ordinary tow company could budge it. Word spread quickly, and within minutes, neighbors spilled into the street to watch the spectacle. Some recorded videos, their laughter echoing through the night as the tow truck struggled in vain. Michael, hearing the commotion, stepped outside calmly. He didn't shout or argue. He simply stood on his porch with his arms crossed, watching, as the HOA's latest plan collapsed in front of the entire community. When the tow driver finally gave up, muttering that he needed industrial-grade equipment to even attempt the job, the crowd erupted in cheers. By morning, footage of the failed tow attempt had gone viral. Headlines mocked the HOA versus truck. Guess who won? And tow truck defeated by HOA's worst enemy. The story spread across the internet like wildfire, turning Crestwood Pines into a symbol of resistance against HOA tyranny. The fallout was immediate. Residents demanded Linda step down as president, blaming her obsession with Michael for dragging the neighborhood into chaos and embarrassment. Several board members resigned outright, unwilling to be associated with her crusade. At the next HOA meeting, a crowd of angry homeowners confronted her directly, their voices rising in unison as they demanded change. Linda tried to defend herself, insisting she was protecting the community. But her words fell flat. No one wanted to hear excuses anymore. The residents had seen enough, and their decision was unanimous. Linda was removed as HOA president. The once powerful figure who had controlled every detail of Crestwood Pines was gone, her reign toppled by the very man she had tried to destroy. Michael, meanwhile, remained steady. He hadn't sought fame, but it had found him. Reporters still came to his street, asking for interviews, but he rarely accepted. He didn't need recognition. His victory was already complete. The HOA had been humbled, the neighborhood freed, and his truck still stood proudly in the driveway. But deep down, Michael knew the story wasn't just about him. It was about every homeowner who had ever felt bullied, every person who had been fined for something petty, every neighbor who had been told they couldn't live freely in their own home. His battle had become a symbol, and that symbol was bigger than any one man, or any one truck. As the sun set over Crestwood Pines, the transport vehicle cast its long shadow across the street. It was more than just a machine now. It was a monument to resistance, a reminder of what happens when ordinary people stand up to unchecked power. And while the HOA would continue in some form, its reign of fear was over. The community was changing, and Michael had been the spark that lit the fire. Still, one final chapter remained. Because as the dust settled and the neighborhood began to rebuild, Michael faced a decision of his own: what to do with the massive machine that had started it all. With Linda Carrington removed as president and the HOA in shambles, Crestwood Pines slowly began to change. The iron grip that had once dictated every flower bed, paint color, and parking space was gone. Residents, once timid and fearful of fines, now felt a sense of freedom they hadn't known in years. Driveways filled with campers, boats, and older cars. Lawns reflected the personalities of the families who lived there, rather than the rigid vision of a controlling board. And at the center of it all stood Michael's massive transport truck. For months, it remained in his driveway, towering over the neighborhood like a monument to defiance. Visitors continued to stop by, snapping pictures and marveling at the sheer size of it. Social media posts turned into memes, and memes turned into merchandise. Shirts, mugs, and bumper stickers appeared with slogans like "Stand tall like Michael's truck" and "Bigger than the HOA." What had begun as a fight over one man's pickup truck had become a nationwide symbol of resistance against petty authority. Michael, however, had never sought the spotlight. He appreciated the support, but to him, the truck wasn't about fame. It was about principle. He knew that as long as it sat in his driveway, it would keep the memory of the battle alive, but it also kept the neighborhood tied to the chaos of the past year. Some neighbors began to quietly suggest that maybe it was time to move forward, to let the community heal without the constant reminder of the fight. Michael thought long and hard about it. The transport truck had served its purpose. It had protected his right to live freely in his own home, humbled an overreaching HOA, and inspired countless people far beyond Crestwood Pines. But perhaps its work was done. Perhaps it was time to let it go, not in defeat, but as a victory lap. One crisp spring morning, Michael made a call. Within a week, a convoy arrived to load the transport vehicle onto a flatbed. Neighbors gathered to watch as the giant machine was carefully winched up, its enormous tires leaving temporary impressions in the driveway that had held it for so long. For a moment, the street seemed strangely empty, as if a giant piece of its identity was being taken away. But then Michael explained what he was doing, and the crowd erupted in cheers. The truck wasn't being scrapped, it wasn't being hidden. It was going to a local military museum, where it would be preserved and displayed as part of an exhibit on community history. The museum director, thrilled by the story's notoriety, promised that the vehicle would stand as a permanent reminder of how one man used it to fight back against unfair authority. A plaque would tell the tale of Crestwood Pines, the HOA that went too far, and the neighbor who stood his ground. When the flatbed pulled away, Michael's driveway felt different, quieter, freer. His old Ford pickup, freshly washed and polished, took its rightful place again. It wasn't as flashy as the transport truck, but to Michael, it meant more. It was the vehicle he had loved all along, the one that had started the fight, and now, finally, it could sit in peace. The neighborhood moved on, but it was never quite the same. The residents carried with them the lesson that authority only works when people allow themselves to be controlled. They had seen firsthand what courage looked like, and it had changed them. Rules became guidelines rather than shackles, and individuality blossomed where conformity once reigned. As for Michael, he returned to his quiet life. He tinkered in his garage, waved to neighbors on his walks, and enjoyed the simple peace he had always wanted. From time to time, he would drive past the museum and see crowds gathered around the transport truck, children climbing on its tires, families taking pictures, and guides telling the story of how one man had parked something bigger than the HOA itself. It always made him smile. What had started as a petty fine had turned into a battle that inspired people far beyond his neighborhood. His defiance had humbled an overbearing system, toppled an arrogant leader, and given countless homeowners a reason to believe they could fight back too. In the end, the truck was more than just metal and rubber. It was a symbol, a legend, and a reminder that sometimes standing tall doesn't mean being the biggest or the loudest. Sometimes it simply means refusing to back down when you know you're right. And that was exactly what Michael had done.